When I first started building Will's Scion of Peace, I thought I was going to be in for a straightforward deck building experience. You know, just throw in some of those big spells or big X spells that we don't normally get to cast, and we just call it good. We're good. But I quickly realized that in order to have the consistency that I wanted, I needed to make some difficult cuts, and I also needed to look at certain cards more critically. Is that card really doing what it says it's doing, or is EDH Rec simply lying to me? You know, sure, it may be high on the synergy score, but then in practice, when you play the card, you may realize that it's actually not performing how you intended it to perform. And that's what made this deck building journey a little bit more arduous than the others. And I would appreciate you sticking around to the end to hear my complete thoughts on a fully kitted out deck, and also a budget deck for under $100 for those of you that are looking for a more wallet-friendly build. Just a few housekeeping items before we get underway with this deck perspective. I think that the most lethal version of this deck involves those cards that win you the game over a certain life total in conjunction with cards that give you an extra turn. So something like Felidar Sovereign coupled with Time Warp, for instance, is an immediate win that you could deploy as early as maybe turn 4 or 5, depending on the right type of mana acceleration that you have available to you. Now, that's not the gameplay experience that I'm going for. And yes, I do have life gain payoffs in this deck, some of which could either win you the game on the spot or perhaps put you in a commanding position to win. But my play groups, and I think also I've just experienced play groups in general, really don't like the text, "you win the game." And, you know, I would encourage you to build that type of deck if you're looking or maybe more interested in experiencing a more fast-paced type of game, or maybe you're playing in a more competitive play group. I think that then it may be the right setting for that. Aside from this, I wanted to point out a few rules things and also some synergies that didn't quite fit nicely into the video anywhere else, but I still think that they're important, so here they are. Number one is don't be afraid to wipe your board while you have Will on it. This is because Will cost reduces himself, so if you tap him before you board wipe, you'll still get the cost reduction to also pay for his commander tax. Now that's pretty big, especially later in the game. It allows you to actually rebuild quite fast. And if you have ways to immediately give Will haste, for instance, you can cost reduce even further, and then you can just keep going and digging. So don't forget to don't be afraid rather, just to board wipe. Just do it. Number two, a little less important, Will has vigilance. So this allows you to go to combat first, swing with Will, and then afterwards on main phase 2, you can tap him to get the cost reduction. This is where cards like Shadow Spear are actually viable within the right build. Finally, a rules thing, yes, Will does reduce the cost of X spells, and you'll see plenty of them in my build. However, it's very important to understand the concept of how the actual casting with a cost reduction works. So when you cast an X spell, you actually assign the value of X as you're casting it. So later down the line, as a completion of the cast, you will apply Will's cost reduction. So what this means in practice is you choose X first, and then you apply whatever the cost reduction is. So let's do an example. So let's say that you've gained 20 life this turn, but you only have 19 cards in your deck. And somewhere in those 19 cards, you know that you have your win condition. You have your Aetherflux Reservoir or whatever it is. So you can't pay 20 into X, because then you deck yourself. So when you cast an X spell to draw some cards, you assign X equals 19 as you're casting the spell, and then your cost reduction will reduce the cost of that amount. So this way, X will equal 19, you won't draw your deck, you'll draw your win condition, game's over. And that's also the same for pretty much every other X spell out there, and that's how the casting sort of mechanic works. Now that that's out of the way, let's crack on. So clearly Will doesn't gain life by himself, and we're going to need some support for this deck. But how do we know where to draw the line? How do we choose which cards to include and which cards to cut? And that was the most difficult decision for this deck. If we have too many effects, then we won't have enough payoff. But on the flip side, if we have too few, then we never have enough to actually reach our payoff in the first place. So I ended up including 21 cards that either gain us life or are concerned with life gain. And I also included 4 ways for us to untap Will to sort of repeat the cost reduction process. Now, I didn't include Swords to Plowshares within those 25 cards, and that's just because normally we'll use that on someone else's creature. However, in the right situation, we can Swords our own creature to get that juicy cost reduction. And I think that between these 25 cards, this should be enough to reliably draw into something to get the life gain rolling, whilst at the same time adequately getting our costs reduced so we can actually make this deck function. This is where cards like Illusions of Grandeur and Delusions of Mediocrity are all-stars, giving us 10 to 20 mana reduction reliably. I've also included Beacon of Immortality for this very reason. However, this card is dependent on your life total, meaning it's not quite as reliable. It doesn't just automatically give you the cost reduction in mass like the other two do. Cards like Soul's Attendant and Soul Warden also have potential to gain us large amounts of life, especially on our opponent's turns when they're summoning creatures. Now, I regard these as cards that allow us to take more advantage of our instant speed cost reduction spells. Then we also have cards like Shabraz the Sky Shark and Drogskull Reaver, which both have life gain synergy and card draw synergy. However, having both on the battlefield at the same time will result in an infinite loop which will deck you out, so please use both of these together in caution. And also in isolation, Drogskull Reaver only triggers once for each life gain event. So for example, if you gain 20 life in one time, that will only net you one card draw. The list goes on with good life gain effects, including extra life gain with Alhamaret's Archive and life gain stapled onto one of our win conditions, Aetherflux Reservoir. You can really go crazy with good life gain synergies in this deck, and it was kind of hard to choose some of the best ones. But now we get to our bigger problem. We can only reduce the generic part of our mana costs, so we need to ensure that we're running enough cards that allow us to untap our lands, which gives us the ability for those bigger, more blowout turns. So cards such as Snap, Unwind, Treachery, and of course our big boy in the deck, Palinchron. Palinchron goes infinite the moment that you can cost reduce it by 5. This is because it's only 2 blue pips to play. Then its ability is only 4 mana to return to hand, which is a total of 6, netting us 1 mana every single time we play it. Infinite mana? What can we do with that? What about a Brain Geyser on Timmy for 420,069? Or maybe a Drown in Dreams for 69,420. You can really get as creative with the numbers as you so desire. I would point out, however, you can also play Rewind in your deck, and that can be included, but Rewind comes with the downfall of being 2 blue pips to play it, whereas Unwind is a single blue pip, which gives us that flexibility in some of our more tight situations where a counterspell needs to be as cheap as possible. Now, before we get to our win cons, I want to challenge some cards that I saw coming up frequently on EDH Rec. First is White Sun Zenith, not to be confused with White Sun's Twilight, which I do have in the deck. The Zenith has the problem of being a 3 white pip card to cast, and I purposely cut all cards that have greater than 2 mana pips in order to cast them. We're already going to be stretching to meet our pip requirements in the first place. What about Pristine Talisman? Well, first of all, it is a 3 mana rock, and we have a 3 CMC commander, so that already doesn't really line up. But also, it's only netting us 1 life per turn, which in the grand scheme of things is unlikely to be contributory, and I'd rather run more efficient life gain cards. I did, however, include this in our budget tech. I also frequently saw people running Aminatu's Augury, despite the fact that they were running plenty of X spells. So if you play the Augury and you hit an X spell, you can't pump the X with your reduction, meaning you simply miss. It's awful. And I don't know why anyone would play that if they're going in a heavier X spell theme. Do not run this card if you're running plenty of X spells because it's going to miss. It will. Invoke the Divine is coming up in a ton of decks. However, I would challenge you to cut this and include Lucky Offering instead. So Invoke the Divine has the problem of being 3 CMC to begin with. And the lower CMC life gain cards that we're running are being cast to get our ball rolling for our cost reduction, not the other way around. So if we cost reduce in order to play Invoke the Divine for 1, we're sort of like defeating the purpose of running these life gain cards to begin with. Plus, we need as many low to the ground 1 CMC cards that gain us life as possible, or cards that may be 2 mana that are a bit more efficient. Finally, I want to point out that Teferi Temporal Pilgrim is cruel and it's not really effective. What do I mean by this? Well, there's various ways to get the ultimate off on Teferi with this specific deck because it's going to allow you to draw so many cards. And I just want to point out that I've had this ultimate cast on me at the table before, and not only does it just feel terrible to have cast on you, but in addition to that, your opponents normally aren't in a position to close out the game from there, including the person that ultimated Teferi, so it often just draws the game out. Every single time it's happened, let me just say, it's drawn the game out, it doesn't win, and normally that paints a target on you, the person that has Teferi, and you end up getting a lot of hate, which you otherwise could have avoided if you simply just didn't play this card. I've already talked about our win cons somewhat, but let's highlight them even further. Cards like White Sun's Twilight, Storm Herd, Finale of Glory, and Grand Crescendo will make a massive board, allowing us to go wide if left unchecked, and simply sweep the games out from underneath our opponents. And you know what? We've gained a ton of life this game, so why not use it with Aetherflux Reservoir? This is an easy include, but just be sure to play it when you're ready to actually execute, because it'll paint an immediate target on your back. Then we get to our extra turn spells, so cards like Time Stretch and Expropriate. And I went with the sort of let's win the game right now sort of extra turn spells, as getting down to 2 blue pips not only seems reasonable, but quite doable in this deck. And also taking multiple extra turns typically just wins you the game on the spot and doesn't allow things just to draw out even further than you need to. Finally, as previously mentioned, we can also just deck our opponents with something like Brain Geyser. I did, however, want to highlight a modal spell, which is Drown in Dreams. So modal spells resolve extremely specifically down the rules text choice by choice on cards where you can choose those multiple modes. This means in Drown in Dreams, you'll get the effect of your opponent drawing cards first and then milling. This means if a player has 60 cards in deck, you only need to pump 20 into the X to completely deck them out. And then when they go to their turn, they would draw and die. However, this is important, they'll have a chance to respond before it gets back to their turn. So they can't, however, respond to the modal effects resolving, the mill and the draw, because that is a part of the spell resolving. The spell is on the stack resolving, and you must resolve it first before you can actually interact and add to the stack again. So at least you have that going for you. But I just wanted to point this out because I think that people maybe would have otherwise missed this when they start playing this deck. As mentioned before, I do have a budget list of this deck available, but despite it being less than $100, it still includes over half of the original cards in the more premium deck list. So you should have no problem consistently breaking ground and casting massive spells. I did just want to highlight some cards that just tickled me to include in the budget list. One is Defenders of Humanity. Now this card is simply being slept on for Will. So it's super cheap, around 25 cents, but it has a really potent effect, and then later on you can refill your board again. I think this is a great budget include. And I also included another board filling effect, Entreat the Angels. Now, if you draw this as your card per turn, you're gonna be doing some ludicrous stuff with your Angels, and I think that it's probably just gonna be a blowout on the game overall. Next is Niambi Esteemed Speaker, which is just gas, being flexible to either protect Will later in the game or perhaps simply bounce something to get huge cost reduction. Try it out, play this card. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my boys, which is Diluvium Primordial and Astral Dragon. Stealing our opponent's biggest spells and then also being able to copy their biggest threats. Yes, please. These cards also importantly are not a dead draw later in the game if Will happens to be off the battlefield and removed. I'm pumped to play both of these decks, but which one do you think is more exciting? I hope that I've inspired you to get your deck crafting hat out and try these out. There's still plenty of good includes that I did not actually put into these lists, so brew to your heart's content. Cards like Will, which are more flexible and can be slotted into a more competitive group, but also a more casual setting, really excite me. It gives us the potential for a more broader play style, and I hope that Wizards continues to expand on this design moving forward for future releases. As always, you can find both deck lists and my other decks on my Archidect profile linked down below. You can also find my TCG Player storefront linked in the description if you wanted to financially support what I'm doing. However, the absolute best way is to subscribe to the channel. Growing the channel means more outreach and more chances to collaborate with other creators on projects, and that's a big goal of mine. Support my addiction so I can continue supporting your addiction. I've been Kyle, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.